Who are the Pharisees of today? So when I ask you this, what do you think the sermon's going to be about? You might reasonably conclude that today I'm going to preach about the evil of hypocrisy or empty formalism in religion. But today's sermon will not be on that topic. It deals with something far more destructive, something far more sinister, an ugly sin hiding in plain sight. So I want to just move the register about talking about the Pharisees. Imagine if we were to say the same thing about another group of people and see how it sounds. So imagine that I started my sermon by telling you I'm going to preach on indigenous people today. And imagine that my sermon was all about alcoholism. Just how that would sit for a bit. If I were to do that, my sermon itself would become a grave sin. My sermon would be racist. It would be denigrating a whole population. I might make a good point about alcoholism, but in the point, while I was doing that, I would be insulting and speaking hate towards a group of people who have a long history of being treated badly and falsely spoken about. Today's sermon on the Pharisees will not be about the evils of hypocrisy, because such a sermon would be doing exactly the same thing as my fictional sermon on indigenous people would be doing. In preaching against sin, the sermon itself would become sin. So within Christian thought, Pharisees often represent Jews and Judaism. So if we can imagine, if you were a Jewish person coming in, sometimes it's hard hearing something that we're used to hearing from a different perspective. This happens all the time. This is essentially what white privilege is, or at least one aspect of white privilege. We just don't hear the harm in our words. We just don't see it. But a person in a minoritized group feels it very deeply and vividly. So a Jewish person hearing a sermon about Pharisees that was all about the evils of hypocrisy would probably not hear a sermon about being more consistent, more true, more faithful, more genuine. They would probably rather hear yet another in the long list of slanderous statements made by Christians leveled against their beliefs, traditions, and ways of life. So today's sermon is not about my sermon on Pharisees today is not about hypocrisy. Rather, it's about the evil of slander and the evil of hating. The Christian church, you don't need to look very far to find this, unfortunately. We have historically slandered Jews immensely and Judaism for millennia. And sometimes this slander is hidden in some of our favorite bits of the Bible. Whether it's actually there or whether it's there in the interpretation of those bits, I will leave for you to determine. One of the ways we sometimes try to neutralize the evil of stereotyping Pharisees, which is essentially what happens when we equate Pharisees with hypocrisy, is we use Pharisees to represent the symbol of the hypocrite that's in us all. So we all could be Pharisees. And we think that we solved the problem. But unfortunately, this does not solve the problem. It makes the problem worse. By symbolizing Jewishness or Pharisaism as that which is evil in everyone, as that which is hypocritical in everyone, in the words of Rabbi Daniel Boyarin, is to allegorize every Jew as the contemptible part of every man. This is not the solution to the problem. This is the problem itself. So let's look at Mark's story today. We have two vignettes in Mark's story. The first has Jesus out in a field on a Sabbath day. His disciples take a little bit of grain, rub it, and eat it because they're hungry. some Pharisees are there and they disapprove and they ask Jesus, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? And Jesus explains to the Pharisees that even within the law, there are exceptions to legal norms when human need is concerned. And there we are, probably, if we're your standard Christian reader, thinking silly, silly Pharisees. But we might want to ask ourselves, what were the Pharisees doing standing in the middle of a field on the Sabbath day? Just imagine that. It's a highly unlikely scenario. It's an extremely unlikely scenario. So what we probably have here, when we read stories like this, we are hearing the stories and the voices and the concerns of the person writing the story as well as those who are in the story. Sometimes we forget that there's a writer and they actually have points of view too, and we just see the story but don't realize that the writer is reflecting some of their concerns. And it is likely that these stories, as well as others, were fashioned. They might have taken some actual stories, but they reworked it, they retold it in such a way to address debates that they were having with their rivals, like across the street, the figurative across the street synagogue. They observed Sabbath in a different way than we do. And there's a debate going on. And these kinds of stories are one way that debate was worked out for them. And what happens in battles, and we see this today, and we see it throughout Christian history, battles about religious observance often result in a stereotype of those we disagree with. And those stereotypes turn the people, they can turn into symbols of what is wrong. So they cease being people, and this is exactly what happens to the Pharisees. They cease being people, and they become symbols of what is wrong, symbols of evil. And this is essentially dehumanizing. They have lost their humanity and they've become a symbol of what is wrong. So the next vignette in the story also happens on a Sabbath, but this time it's in a synagogue. And there's a man there with a paralyzed hand, and Jesus asks the Pharisees, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? They are silent, they don't respond, and this makes Jesus angry. We probably conclude, if we're reading along with the text, that they're so caught up in their legal pinpoints that they miss the power of God moving in their midst. And as it happens, this is something that humans do. We can get so caught up in minutia that we miss the big picture. We miss the forest for the trees, and so we get caught up in little details and miss the bigger, more important move that's happening. That happens all the time. So that part's not unrealistic. It's very realistic. The problem is when we allow the Pharisees to become a symbol of that, when they become a symbol of that kind of legalistic approach to life, which is exactly what has happened in Christian tradition. When that happens, then the evil is still an evil. We shouldn't do that, but we also shouldn't be using slander to make our ethical points. So who were the Pharisees? It might help to get a little bit of an idea of the Pharisees. Unfortunately, if you restrict yourself to the pages of the New Testament, you will not necessarily get a very wonderful picture of the Pharisees. And this is largely because the early Christian church they were the rivals. They were the people they were battling against across the street, so to speak. And so what the writings reflect the polemics, the arguments that are going on. So you're not seeing a really gracious picture of the Pharisees. But in the Mishnah, which is the earliest Jewish text that was written, it came together in around 200 more or less in the Common Era, but has material that goes back to the time of Jesus. In that, we have some ideas of what the Pharisees were about, and probably a little bit more generous from their point of view. So the Pharisees, one of the things they wanted to do was take the experience of the holy out of the temple and bring it to all the people so that all the people, not just the elites, the priests at the temple, all the people could experience the holiness and presence of God. This is something that exactly Jesus is wanting to do. That parallels Jesus' mission exactly. The Pharisees were popular with the people, but unlike the Sadducees and the chief priests, they had little to no actual institutional authority. Again, like Jesus, who was also popular and had no institutional authority. And this is something, the next point is something that you really won't get if you stay in the pages of the New Testament. Their ethical perspective was actually very similar to Jesus's. So one of the things we see in the Mishnah, as well as in the later Talmud, which is based on the Mishnah in large part, is there's all sorts of debates about how to keep the Sabbath. There's chapters on what to do or not to do, and you have people who say this, Rabbi X says this, but then Rabbi Y says this, and there's debates and discussions, and that's the way Jewish texts run. They have these great big arguments and debates. It's quite lovely. And this makes me wonder if perhaps what Jesus was doing was really just participating in this Jewish debate, but that his later followers maybe misunderstood it in the light of their own conflicts. And they saw it rather than being figuring out how to live into the mystery of doing God's purpose on how to interpret law, how to live into God's presence faithfully. They saw it more about how do you determine who the villains and the heroes are, which is, of course, something that we can all fall into. In the Mishnah, one of the conclusions, after all this debating and discussions, it says, in any matter of doubt as to danger of life, overrides prohibitions of the Sabbath. In other words, if there's any time when keeping the Sabbath endangers life, don't keep the Sabbath. That's core bedrock in Jewish teaching. That is, like, I have rabbi friends who have emphasized exactly the same thing. It's like the Sabbath observance is very important, but not at the expense of human life. And of course, this perspective is hauntingly close to what we find in today's gospel on the lips of Jesus. So all this is to say the world is a complex thing, and we have different points of view and different perspectives, and we can and even should disagree. There's a place for healthy debate, and debate is important. We should not be silent in the face of debate. We should be, if we have something that bothers us, we should be able to speak it out. But what we should not do in speaking it out is to fall to the temptation of turning to the person that we disagree with into an enemy or a monster. Disagree, but maintain the humanity. And we live in a society that does that every single day, all the time, everywhere. And it's getting worse. It's not getting better. So we're being pulled along by society to do exactly that. But as Christ followers, we belong to a countercultural movement that has at its ethical core an impulse to resist this. So I might disagree with you, you might disagree with me, but God forbid that either of us turn the other into a stereotype. That either of us that I don't turn you into a one-dimensional character in my story. You are a hero in your story just as I am a hero in my story. We're all heroes in our own story, and sometimes we just don't listen hard enough to see that with the people we disagree with. So it's time for us to revisit our attitudes towards the Pharisees. Indeed, it's time for us to revisit our attitudes, I think, towards everyone we have vilified. The Pharisees, like Jesus, wanted people to be connected and faithful to God. They wanted to figure out how to do this in life-giving ways, even while they, amongst themselves and perhaps with Jesus, did not always agree as to what this might or might not mean. Sound familiar? It's exactly what we do every day. We're all trying to be faithful to God, but we don't all think exactly that faithfulness looks exactly the same. We have different ideas, and that's the way it should be. So as we continue to explore faithfulness to God and living into God's presence and being community, may we keep Jesus as our guiding light throughout all of it. As we seek to hear, and that's so important, listening in new and deeper ways to those we disagree with. May we learn to take up our old stories that we love, our old beloved stories, but may we make sure that in taking them up, we do not use them as a means of slandering our neighbor. Our hatred will always be a bigger problem than the person we disagree with. Our hatred will always be a bigger problem in our life if we're trying to walk with Jesus than the person we're disagreeing with. And we always want to put it on the other person, and again, you can disagree with the person, but if you hate that person, you've crossed the line. So who are the Pharisees of today? I hope that we see the Pharisees of today as those who may think and act differently from us, yet those we honor and respect and are seeking to learn more about. Who are the Pharisees of today? They are and were the cherished of God, just like we are. Amen.